All right. Welcome to the SIG Arch call for October 24th, 2019. We have a relatively short agenda, so we'll start at the top and see where we end up. Wanted to check in with some of the things that we talked about last time. Is Tim on the call?
He is not, but I will just mention several of us who volunteered for that. He sent out an email yesterday, and we're planning on meeting on Friday. So it's getting underway. Basically, status right now. We'll be meeting on Fridays typically. So I don't know if it's going to be tomorrow, but
was that thread open, or if other people want to drop by, can they, or is it?
So it's not, the actual time isn't specified yet. There's just been a couple of email exchanges right now. So
okay.
The goals here are really to read through, identify, or scan through the titles of new TEPs, identify ones that may have architectural significance or that are potentially controversial, read them through, review them, potentially bring them here to the larger group or the mailing list if we believe they need that sort of discussion.
I think the biggest part of this is that it will shame the small number of people who signed up who have not maybe been reading as many as they thought they should. It will shame us into reading them. So if you're not in the invite list, it just means you're doing a good job. So we excluded you intentionally, Jordan.
No. We want the invite list to be public to maximize the shame. That's really where I was going.
Let us see how it goes.
All right. This is why they don't ask me to host. All right. Technical debt, project board. Alejandro.
Alejandro is on.
Hey everyone. So I'm Alejandro Jorge. So in the technical debt area, we James, Antonio, Mayank, and myself have been meeting. Thus far, we had 2 meetings to start organizing, in which we started organizing this project. If you want to catch up, I added the link to the meeting notes now to the meeting notes for all the where we document everything that we have been doing, discussing, and the like. You in the meeting notes, you will also find a link to the technical debt research project board, which is on the Kubernetes organization page. Those right now we are planning to meet every week on Wednesdays at 1:30 US Pacific. If anyone wants to join, please say so in the SIG architecture Slack channel, and somebody will notice. And right now I'm the one managing the invites, so I'll send the invite to whatever email you decide. Right now, we're starting to look into all the issues in Kubernetes. We are looking for any feature requests or any complaints. I have received a lot of comments, a lot of backing for by users or by the community. We are looking into anything that's really old, and we are focusing on trying to discover why we accrued so much technical debt in certain areas. And number 2, once we actually have a better understanding of all the things I need to work on, we want to shed some light in them and work with SIG architecture and SIG leads to move them forward. Right now, we are essentially in an experimental trial. So for the next couple of weeks, 2 weeks, we're going to see what data we gather. And then based on that, we'll see how to move this whole effort forward.
Mayank, can you speak a little bit about the criteria that the list of things that we said we were going to look for?
Sure. Yeah. I think the idea is to look at issues, bugs, or things that the wider community has been asking for, or kind of figure out the pain points or repeated wants from the community, which we have kind of either failed to notice or failed to address because either that was not part of our SIG's priority list, or the community itself didn't uh, uh, pony up and wrote a cap to fully clarify what they wanted. So basically, kind of gather issues around those topics and figure out what are the basic pain points that the community has been repeatedly asking for, or in different areas, and try to come up with a list of issues in broad categories, and then present it to the SIG architecture, and see like which ones we can like. I feel like the eventual goal should be to kind of make this a a thing where we can, for every release, take out some things from this tech debt board and make it part of each SIG's goal for like 5% of the release, or for that SIG kind of comes from the tech addressing tech debt. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sounds good to me. I just wanted to make sure that people see what are we looking for, like number of emojis, number
Sure.
of, yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it'd be helpful to understand what is being categorized as technical debt and what is being categorized as like wish list features.
Yep.
So, because a lot of these categories, probably the things that have the most discussion and votes and attempts at PRs are not necessarily debt, but feature requests. So, yeah, just wanted to understand how you were dividing those up.
Right. I mean, if you see the section just above, we were trying to figure out, oh, how do we distinguish between a feature request and a tech debt? So, and we have to like add more things to it for sure. But
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah, it'd be good to kind of hear the outcomes of some of those once those get fleshed out a little better. All right, John.
Yeah, I just wanted a quick reminder here. We are starting this PRR, production readiness review pilot team, to kind of suss out exactly how we're going to do this, and put together the questionnaire and start the sort of implementation of the first version of the CAP. We had a kickoff a couple weeks ago, and now I sent out a sign-up form. We have half a dozen or so people, so we've got some momentum behind it. But anybody who's interested, sign up. Obviously, anybody can come later too, but this way you get to help pick the regular meeting time. So that's all. I'm going to sort of shut that form down at the end of the day today. So if you want to do it, today's the day.
Sounds good. For sub-project readouts, I guess API review is the only one. Were we going to try to do 1 or 2 a week?
I think 1 a week is sufficient, unless.
Okay.
I mean,
if we meet every other week, then that means that each one reads out once every other month, which is maybe a little.
We'd mentioned about doing 2 every meeting.
Yeah.
Oh, did we? Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't remember correctly, I guess. So
okay. We'll tee up 2 for the next time, unless
Conformance
wants to give a update. But I'll talk to the API review stuff. So looking at the board, these are the requested reviews. There are a few that have not been picked up. I reached out to the reviewers for those. One is not prioritized for that project right now. This one the pod affinity, I think, is the only one that is actually blocked on API review and is a priority. So I reached out to the API reviewer. We'll try to get movement on that. There were 2 out of project requests that Justin had opened a while ago, and I think Clayton just reached out to him to try to set up a time to start working through those. Then a couple in progress, and then a handful that have changes requested. As far as interesting topics that have come up recently in API review, the question about deprecating individual resources in a version came up in the sort of incidentally during the CSI topology review. The idea that if you have an API group that has lots of different resources in it, once you promote one of those resources to stable, we typically mark the beta version deprecated immediately to start the clock and indicate people should move to the stable version. But the question was whether or not that individual resource could be or should be dropped from the beta version while there were still other resources in that beta version. So there's a discussion that started in the topology review. If you're interested in that topic, can maybe start a thread on the mailing list rather than.
So Jordan, a similar thing came up around pod template in that I think it's just in the V1 group or the core group, but
yeah.
I think we decided not to deprecate it. I think the issue is still open, but what we got when we put an issue out saying we wanted to deprecate it, we did get some feedback that it is in use by some folks. You know, while it doesn't have anything backing it typically, I'm not sure that we have really a good justification for deprecating that.
Yeah, so the V1 and extensions versions predated any concept of like subdividing resources among groups and our actual policy on deprecation. So there is some, I don't know if wiggle room is the right word, but like we kind of have to figure out what to do with things in those groups specifically. But for things like storage, where we had written the deprecation policy and then started this version, we need to follow the policy more closely. So the question is, what does the policy mean? Anyway, I plan to start a thread hoisting that conversation out. Oh, Tim, you're there.
He's joined.
I was just listening, waiting for you to get to the good part.
No,
my feeling is the way the rules are written are very clear. If we want to rewrite the rules, that is something we can consider, but I'm not doing it again.
Yeah.
I wrote the last one. It was incredibly painful to get to language that I thought was clear enough that we could point to it and say, not allowed to do that. In this case, I think, as I said in the thread, and I commended Michelle for stirring the hornet's nest, I think that the way we're versioning APIs at this point is a mess if this is what we want to do. If we want to actually make developers' lives easier, we're doing the wrong things. Daniel's looking at me askance from across the room, but we don't have to have the discussion here.
Yeah.
But adding things to V1 Beta 1 after V1 has launched means you can never remove them, because we only talk about deprecation in terms of groups, API versions.
Yeah, some of the examples speak about individual resources. So I had read them in terms of individual resources. When you write to an API, you're writing to an individual resource API. But
I would have gone with individual resources as well.
Yeah, I think we found that like the group distinction, did that really help people consume sets of resources? Like at one point we had this idea that groups, that people could only have a client pointing to a single group, so they had to consume all the resources from that group. But then we evolved that was very painful, so we evolved our client. That's no longer the case. You can consume resources from multiple groups without any.
Yeah, just in practice, is like I've started to get is like on the OpenShift side and some of the projects I've seen, like as you start to get into the V2 territory, the amount of churn you cause by bumping everything is extremely high and doesn't feel worth it. Whereas going and selectively coming up with, new versions of a resource where justified is a little bit more tactical. Like this kind of gets into the V1 beta 1 is significantly different from V1 in terms of perception. V1 and V2 are also substantially different. The way people think about them, they take place over longer timescales. I'd be concerned about applying a rule that doesn't actually have any practical benefit for folks unless we can find those examples.
Yeah, and we spent a fair amount of effort to get to sparse API groups to make this work for apps, and it was cron jobs, wasn't it? I remember that being very personally.
Cron job would have been much more difficult if we had to rev job and all of the others along with it.
Yeah.
I think it would have created a V2 that was confusing for no purpose for some of those resources.
I'm not sure I understand what's confusing about them. Like they should just be promotable, like in identical form, right?
But promoting them causes a cost on every downstream consumer across the board, like starting timelines of changing the objects. You have to change all of your objects, people who have clients. And so I think the sparseness is like the first phase of when you're trying to come up with a reason. You have to make a change, but you can't do it within the group version. If you force everybody to change everything to consume that one thing, I think you're getting into a lot of additional work for very little benefit. Now, I agree, there is a confusing thing, which is if you do V2 of 1, you're not going to ask. I haven't seen that be as much of a problem as the continual revs of bumping versions. Like V1 beta 1 to V1 for a large number of our groups was incredibly invasive to the entire ecosystem. Like I see PRs on other repos, like CockroachDB was one I saw the other day, where they're bumping to V1 apps, and it's a disruptive change that they have to spend time thinking about the difference between V1 and V1 beta 1. Doing that for future things, just because one of the resources changed, starts to worry me a lot more.
I mean, on the one hand, if we're changing one resource and all the others are just being carried forward, then the only change you need to make is in your client, like which version you're going to consume, if they're schematically and semantically identical, right? If they're actually different in a meaningful way, then they probably should be a new version anyway. But it's that aside, I don't want to have the whole conversation here. If we're going to say that deprecation applies to individually versioned resources, I think we, aside from the fact that when we talk about GVK, the group and version are lumped together, that seems to not be true anymore. We can rewrite or retool parts of the deprecation policy to be very clear that that versioning covers individual resources, and then we can say that deprecating and removing something from an API group is appropriate. At that point, though, I don't know. I have lots of questions, but we can find the right words in there to make it clearer that that's the case. I don't have a problem with that. It's just not what it says today.
Yeah, I think I would try to figure out like what the implications of every, like there are a few directions we could take. We could take what you're saying is the current stance where you wait until everything is lived out the deprecation period in a given group version and then turn off that whole group version. And the cost there, I guess, is we serve like individual resources that we could have turned off earlier. We serve them for longer, I guess. And it requires you to graduate everything in the version. So sometimes like you're ready to promote one thing to V1, but not everything, there are independent development efforts in the same group. So
what it means is that the choice of groupings becomes really significant as opposed to.
Right. And early on, like we said, we wanted to avoid like single resource API groups, like a group of one.
But that's where we are. I mean, that is like,
that's what we're asking for.
I remember very clearly some fellow who jumped on our mailing list very, very early on and said, you guys are doing it all wrong. Daniel remembers this guy. You're doing it all wrong. You should version every resource individually, and that's just what they are, right? And we said, you're crazy, get out of here. And now here we are 4 years later. I hope that guy's not in this meeting because I don't remember his name. But
He was
like
right.
what we are talking about is every kind is versioned independently, and that's, I mean, like, am I misinterpreting the placement?
So sometimes there are sets of related resources. So like RBAC, all of those were promoted in lockstep. They work with each other. They were promoted together,
But that's
tested together.
informal, right? Like that's,
Yeah.
we agreed to do those things in lockstep because they make sense in lockstep. But if they're in a group and there's one thing that did not get promoted, then like we're not subgrouping. God help us.
I don't know. I think I stand by the fact that cron jobs are still in beta and the rest of apps is in V1. Like I
Cron
think that
jobs is in batch, but sure.
Sure. Okay. Sorry. It used to be.
You could, the historical argument was, well, then it should have been in a different group because the group was supposed to be meaningful. That's why we called it a group. But if what we really believe with our 2020 hindsight that groups actually aren't that meaningful that individual resource versions are, I'm totally cool with that. We should adjust our language and we should adjust the rules. The rules talk about removing API versions. They do not talk about removing API resource versions.
Although I agree with the sentiment, I would hope that just because we have so much, I don't know, code written, both internal and external now, that if we're going to make any of these types of changes, it'd be like an API v2 schema idea. Because we already have people who have mountains of code written against this. I don't know how you do it in a compatible way.
Yeah, I don't think we're talking about changing how you access the API.
Changing it.
We're talking about just how the policy talks about like how things change over time. And we technically have the ability to deprecate and remove individual resources. But the policy as written is not clear that that's okay to do. So
I would happily review if somebody wants to take the front on writing the deprecation rules changes. Hopefully it's pretty surgical and not wide reaching.
yeah, I really think it's like 2 sentences that talk about versions, and you would say version of a resource.
Hold on, we're gonna switch. Why don't you mute here? So we're gonna switch computers for the Zoom. How's that go?
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
How much pushback did we get for all the things that we dropped in 117, I guess?
116, the
16.
extension
Yeah,
resources?
yeah.
Very little. I mean, the ripples were big, but it was, the deprecation period was generous for those. There was, I did not see any pushback related to all of the apps and workloads resources getting deprecated and no longer being served, but ingress is still being served. So I saw no issues with one resource remaining in that group version and the others not being served. All the issues were just around, oh, I need to switch which workloads API I'm using now.
And it was mostly just replace string, right? It wasn't even like people had to make more changes.
No, the schema changed for some resources, and the requirements for like specifying labels and selectors changed for others. So there were conversion steps required, but that's not related to doing a whole version at once or individual resources. So
okay,
I'll take a stab at seeing what it would take to express that.
And just thank you, Jordan. I'm happy to help and to review it. I can't sign up for it right now. Not that you're any less busy than me, but I think if we're going to pursue this, I think actually the changes are more wide-ranging than just the deprecation policy. Like I feel like there's lots of language and just the way we talk about stuff that we should start adjusting if we agree that this is actually the semantic that we are embracing.
Yeah, and in addition, like the examples for developers, like what should you do if you want to remove a field? Like how can you do that? How many versions do you have to do it over, and round tripping, and like we kind of hand wave at some of those things, and we say things that you may not do, but we don't actually give great guidance about how someone could and should.
Yeah, we tried to keep the deprecation stuff like relatively to the point, and not turn it into a book so that somebody could reasonably look at it and internalize the rules. But if we need to do more examples, that's fine too.
Okay.
And you seem to be the vault of how to do X, Y, and Z within the API machinery. So I'm always consulting you when I can't remember what the process is anyway.
All right. I'll
Encyclopedia Jordanic.
something and I'll send it to the list as well.
Thank you.
All right. Looks like the conformance thing got moved up to the readout section. So
I was going to push it out till next week. John, feel free to chime in if I've missed anything. It's kind of last minute. One of the two things we have going on to support our P1 and P0 are the BDD KEP and the Prow Conformance Bot KEP. So far, we've been measuring operations, and that's the list of all endpoints, is another word we've been calling it. But it's not a great picture for everything. As we add more and more tests, sometimes we'll remove things and add things that have an impact. For example, we had a really good PR that sped up our test runs speed-wise by getting rid of the cleaning up of namespaces. But that bit of code doing the namespace cleanup was called by every test. So when we stopped using that code in that way, we actually dropped coverage quite a bit. And trying to make sure that what we are measuring on is meaningful. So I wanted to make sure we had an agreement on what the numerators and denominators were for increasing our percentages of coverage. So the only thing we currently have fully agreed on, I think, is operations. I just wanted to make a quick check that the definition of that as we go through down into the numerators and denominators of conformance coverage. But with results to the PR bot that will be blocking for the suggestions that will be blocking for all PRs that are in KK is defining back to the PR the list of specific numerators and denominators that are added or removed. So if we're increasing the numerators, I think that, or increasing the denominators or the target, then I think that's okay. We just need to flag it as maybe something that needs to be removed. Go ahead, Dims.
So this is basically you're trying to, there were many emails about conformance this week, right? This was one of the ones that you sent or Jordan sent.
This was the one that I think Tim sent. Talking
Okay.
about conformance starting to show up in CI and blocking, or not just conformance, if I understood correctly, but just API test coverage in general. Is that correct?
Maybe we need to step back a little bit and say what we are trying to do here, Hippie.
Sorry, I was trying to roll. I was taking in, please do a readout for this week, and I'm trying to just read out what we did.
Yeah.
Right. What was the ask on the mailing list, and then?
This was the thread that was talking about introducing a CI job to demonstrate API coverage and or conformance coverage.
So
Okay.
TLDR was that we have APIs that should have been should have had conformance tests written for them, and the overall API coverage dropped right over time, and we've been noticing this across releases. Like Hippie's been reporting out to the group, they have API Snoop running, they're seeing a drop in coverage, and we try to, on inspection, we figure out what the APIs are, and we determine what the APIs should be doing. They are clearly APIs that we should have conformance tests for. This is kind of against the policy that's listed down in the KEPs. So we wanted to enable a PR blocking job. And so Hippie wrote up a proposal to have a very conservative means by which we can start to approach this, and feedback is solicited. But I think we have policy, we don't have enforcement. So this is a method of getting us towards that enforcement.
So this is a pre-submit job which will basically block PRs.
Eventually. we're going to do this in stages. So Hippie's proposal mentions having periodic jobs at first to gather data and make sure that we're right, then report back to the broader group. And then over time, as we feel like we are correct, then we'll eventually turn it into a PR blocking job.
Thank you.
All right. Was there other topics for conformance that you wanted to bring up?
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh.
And there was another, I didn't have the link to it handy, but I believe there was a conformance PR from, or kept from Liggett around reducing, we noticed that we run our beta test, we remove our beta and alpha features that a lot of tests won't pass.
Yeah, I'll throw a link into the section as well.
Thanks for that. That was really good.
Yeah, so this is already something that's part of conformance, like the conformance policy. Like you're not allowed to use beta APIs, and there are multiple issues that have been looking through logs of conformance test runs and saying, hey, look at all these beta things that are getting called. And so this is just a proposal to, like the clearest way to demonstrate that beta stuff is not required is to turn it off and then pass conformance. So that's what we will be working on.
Do we want to do this in 170 or?
I mean, I think it doesn't have to hit a release boundary exactly. If you look at the cap, I'll drop the link in later. The first step is just identifying what beta things currently are required, either by the setup tools or by the conformance tests, and then putting things in place pre-submit to keep us from adding new dependencies on beta stuff. So the sooner we get that in place, the better. It doesn't have to sync up with a release boundary. And then having issues for all of the individual beta dependencies. Some of those we know of now and are working to fix. Some of those are APIs that need to graduate, and there's work there, and we know about that. Some of those I'm sure we'll discover in the next week or two as we're working to set this up. So once we have the list of things that need to be burned down, then we can figure out timeframes and prioritize them. But I mean, the sooner the better, and like I said, it doesn't have to sync up with the release boundary.
I think I'd love to help with that, Jordan. Our last part there is actually making sure everybody's clear on what the current suggested numerators and denominators are. Operations being if a path doesn't have beta or alpha in it, then it's considered GA, and that's for operations, which are separate from fields. And then for fields, it's whether or not the object itself is alpha or beta. So that's GA, that's what we consider to be GA, and whether we should go all the way down to the string or integer. So those denominators get pretty large. Like just for looking at pod spec, when you're going from pod to pod spec, it's 673, or something close to that. And I'm trying to find the best way to help define those, whether we do a KEP or a Google Doc, and we'll go forward with that. Watch operations also had some interesting conversations and some this week, where we have 170 some odd operations that include the watch, and whether we wanted to use dynamic client, for example, to go through and query all of those and do some create to make the plumbing on those move forward. But if we want to just find rather than an automated way, finding a way to actually define what it means to have meaningful watch operation tests, so that we have this burn down list, both for pod spec fields, watch operations, just in the same way we do for our operations. And the last thing we've had is the ongoing collaboration on the BDD CLEP KEP, including some collaboration between our team and John's team.
Forgive my ignorance. What is BDD?
It's behavior-driven development. I can link the KEP to it.
That'd be great.
But part of it is trying to generate a list of all the behaviors that we think that Kubernetes should have. So we have this burn down list of behaviors to write tests for. Some of it's automated in generating from our Swagger and our documentation. And some of it will be just generated by experts saying, this is what it should do. I'm not going to write a test, but we're going to define it and agree that this does need to be tested so that that burn down list can be accurately reflected in the numerator and denominator of our target.
And so this is formalizing.
Jordan, you just went silent.
How about now?
Better.
This is trying to formalize what is currently written in prose in like API documentation. Like if you set this field to this thing over here happens.
That's correct.
Okay.
And also, go ahead.
No.
So that some of that is automated and some of it's going to be going through the different SIGs to help capture the things that need to be tested so that we can be sure that it runs everywhere.
Okay. Yeah, if you could link those to the doc, that'd be great.
Yeah, the other conformance related one was Derek was asking a question about was it device plugins, right? Derek, do you remember that conversation on Slack?
Yeah. My question was basically just trying to get clarification on the note that Tim sent out. I think we reached that where there are features that go to GA that don't impact the end user facing API, and so device plugins or new topology or a lot of the more, I don't want to say exotic, but the more how individual components interact that are backed by feature gates that don't actually impact the end user API, how we want to treat those. And my takeaway from the discussion was that we're not truly changing our policy in any way. Our API conformance was still at the API level, and we weren't necessarily requiring conformance tests for these other points of variability. And that's not to say we don't have CRI conformance, CRI tests and that sort of thing, but some of these can get difficult in our available infrastructure tests. Does that make sense, James?
Yeah, I'm just waiting to see if Tim jump in here and see if he had any other thoughts there.
So from a high level view, we've talked about the notion of profiles for a long time. And I know John had mentioned that we want to start to actually solidify what it means to be a profile for something. A concrete example here that we use is typically storage. We want to basically have some level of tests that verify that your storage provider integration meets a certain criteria against the API. Yeah, but we still have yet to do that work, so we have not taken it on. So we don't address it yet inside of Conformance, but we do plan to eventually handle these things. It's been the plan of record for a long time, but it's just everything we do, because we're such a small group, rolls at a glacial pace.
Yeah, so things like NUMA and like niche features like that would be the same type of thing. Like you support NUMA or you support this exotic storage driver. However, those slot into conformance once we figure that out.
Yeah, and I don't want to misrepresent at least what we're doing in SIG. I mean, there are tests for these things. It's just not always available hardware to test them. So, but the tests emerge.
Okay. Were there any other topics? We got about 20 minutes. If no one has anything else, we can end early. Going once, twice, nothing in chat. All right. Thank you, everyone. We will slot up the other two subprojects for a readout next time.
Thanks, Jeff.